How's it going, guys? I'm Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy.
I'm a workaholic. But I guess you kind of have to be a Scrum. But just some goals of the presentation. We're going to do a brief discussion of the Scrum, what it is, how you use it, step through just a couple of the key components of it in the new venture process. So when you're going about starting a company or building an application where you're not quite sure what you're building, how Scrum really applies to that, and then really the applications that it has to start up. So first off, we'll talk a little bit about Scrum. It is an agile development methodology. It goes relatively quick. You work on roughly 1 or 2 week sprints. It uses uses user stories to track your priorities as well as what features need to go into your app. Typically, they're documented or listed as the user shall be able to do this, or the administrator shall be able to do this. Lastly, it's got built-in analysis and estimation techniques, so that way you can actually visualize your progress throughout the application. So a little bit about the background. There's 3 main artifacts: a prioritized product backlog, which is based on business values. That means whatever you put into the backlog is very important to the business as well as the company that's building the app. A sprint backlog, which just takes all your tasks and breaks them down into each individual sprint. And those are typically, like I said earlier, built on 1 or 2 week intervals. And finally, a release backlog. That just maintains a list of all the completed user stories that you've already done. You can use a variety of tools to track these, whether it's through SkyDrive, Dropbox. There's also a lot of plugins for things like Redmine, Trello, or even Pivotal, so that way you can go in and track these. I've used Google Drive the most, primarily because it creates an openness between the team that you're working with and allows you to easily collaborate on certain documents, especially things like the product backlog. So there's a variety of different estimation techniques you can use. The biggest one, I think, is planning poker. I like it the most. I've used buckets like 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, and 8 hours, which are tasks that can be completed in less than a day. Good reason for this is when you're talking with companies and you want to know what exactly you've got left to do. You can sit down and be like, well, that's not really going to take me less than a day, maybe 4 hours. I'll have it done by lunch. And then additional tasks that take longer a day can be 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, and 10 days, and those are obviously broken down into smaller tasks that are easily more manageable. Some of the biggest benefits about it is that it delivers the highest value business features first. That being said, I believe I read a statistic on it in an article. I have references at the end, where they say that over half the features that are delivered in a software product are actually not even used. And by prioritizing the higher business value features first, you end up getting a more usable and better product in the end. It's nice because it systematically removes any kind of impediments or risks that come up as you're going through your development process. This is done through daily stand-ups or through post-mortem, so whenever you get down to the end of a sprint, you can say, hey, this came up, we need to mitigate this, and it lets you attack the problem head-on rather than waiting until your first release and say, guys, we got a problem here. So, additionally, you got this kind of feedback loop that I'll discuss a little bit more about later. It lets you just keep in constant contact with either the customer, your client, or whoever you're developing the product for. Nice thing about Scrum is that it also gives you a projection to time of completion because you compute your average velocity and how quickly you're moving through sprints as well as completing tasks. You can kind of give your customer an idea as to, well, I'll have this product done in a couple of weeks by the end of the next sprint. And it helps you just stay on task as well as address if you're going to be going past the project deadline. Some of the trade-offs is that there's very little design consideration that goes into place when you're working with Scrum. A lot of people have the tendency to just take your requirements and just hop right into your product instead of standing back and say, should I actually build this right first? Another downside is that it freezes your project schedule. If you don't complete all your tasks in your one sprint, you have to actually stop and finish that sprint before you're able to move on. And that sprint actually gets flagged as, you took more time to complete this. Additionally, teams are allowed to self-organize, so the onus is on your team to complete their tasks. If they don't, then a single team member can actually set your entire project schedule back. And then finally, there's this continuous inspect and adapt cycle where features can be injected into your product development, and you may not even realize it that, now all of a sudden we have feature creep and we need to cut out some of these features before we deliver them to our champion. So the new venture process is a little bit different than when you actually go and just release a product. Typically when you're developing a product, you know that someone wants it, but the new venture process is slightly different in the sense that you have to sit down and consider, okay, well, what do my customers really want in this application, and is it really going to be useful? Just a quick overview. We're actually not going to step through all of this. We're going to just hit on a few of the key components of the software engineering cycle and what we're going to be doing. But you do a lot with customer analysis, who will be using your product, who will be interacting with it on a day-to-day basis, a little bit of the value prop, why they should use your application over any other application, how you maintain ownership of that product and not let companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft steal it, as well as your capital requirements. You are working on a budget most of the time, and you want to keep this as low cost as possible. So when you're developing when you're trying to figure out who will be using your application, one of the best ways I found to do it is through the use of personas. Who's going to be using this, when they will be using it, and you want to get down into the nitty-gritties. Is the person that's going to be using your application, are they married? Do they have multiple sources of income that can be spent on your product? This changes the difference if you're going to be selling your app for $5 versus $50. When they will be using it. Are they going to access it from their phone, or are they going to access it from their computer? And that even touches on how. And I'm sure everyone's seen this diagram before. Show of hands if you haven't. 361. Anyone? No? Nice try, Doreen. Anyways, the one big thing you want to pull out of this is that you need to maintain each point of the triangle in order to maintain your quality. If you let any part of this slip, then your product can actually fall down the hole. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, scope is a big one that people fall into, where they just inject features in. Budget is probably one of the other stronger ones if you have enough money to keep developing it. There's plenty of free tools that you can use, but they can only take you so far. So again, applications to startup ventures. Feedback loops are nice. It keeps you constantly in contact with the customers. Make sure you're developing the right product. Make sure that you're addressing concerns that they have. Maybe the app's not as usable as you think it is. It gives you timely deliverables and lets you make sure that you're getting something out there. We had an instance over the summer where someone every week came up with a new feature and started working on that feature and never released anything by the end of it. So all he had at the end was just an image, no actual implementation. Yeah, and it gives, like I said, it gives you the continuous measurable process if you are progress. Without that, I'd say most apps probably fail if you don't see something coming from what you're doing. Like I said, prioritizes high priority business features. Half of software features are developed and never used, like I said earlier. And just by being able to identify which ones are more valuable to the business, you can actually cut down development time and get your product out sooner rather than later. I guess at this point I can open up for questions and discussions. At every one of these companies I've actually used Scrum. IBM was a little tricky because they use their own flavor of it, but in my experience most companies do. So any questions?
Why does the SE department not like Scrum so much? Because all I hear about is senior project.
Most of the time it's because they don't use it right or use it well, I guess. I think there was one team that I recall that said that they were using Scrum, but then they were using more of an iterative method. But it's really because it's a little too flexible, and with it, I don't know. You'll have to ask the SE department for more info as to why they don't like it. Doreen?
Can you talk a little bit how IBM, I guess especially, they adapt Scrum to their own needs? Because I know when you think IBM, you don't think agile or new or anything.
So when I was working there, we were actually in the process of switching from their oldest reporting software to Hyperion, which was even an intermediary step because they were also right at the time switching over to Cognos. So one of the things that I had to do was take, I think there was something like 30 or 40 reports, take them from their old system, build them into Hyperion, then build them over into Cognos as well. So a typical task for me would have been, build this within Hyperion and make sure the functionality works there, then build it into Cognos. And unfortunately, I couldn't just shortcut it and just build it straight into Cognos because they weren't sure if they were moving over to it, but they still wanted the functionality there. And when I said that they use their own flavor of it, they do it all through Excel spreadsheets and their Lotus suite, which is a little bit of a pain to work with, but they don't like leveraging the open source tools that are available to them.
Cool, thanks.
P-Chat.
Hey Jeremy, how did you use Scrum while developing Attaché during the summer startup program?
You're lame, you know that, right? Anyway, so we one of the things that we did use was the nice sticky note exercise. I'm sure everyone's gone into that lab and seen papers on the wall, into the open lab, and seen papers on the walls with these little sticky notes and burn down charts on it. That was excellent, but we didn't quite use the graphing method on paper. We did that all through Google Drive. That was a little bit nicer because we could just template everything and then create an entire Excel spreadsheet for each individual and then condense them down into a single one. We did use the sticky note story points though because it helped easily move things over, and Trello has actually become a really good substitute for that. We are actually using that in senior project right now, and it still creates that same visual effect of taking your task and dragging it into your backlog and moving it from your backlog into your release backlog. So,
Well, one thing I was hoping you'd mention is that even though we are graphing inside Drive, we also had these whiteboards behind us.
yeah,
So right behind us, we'd be sitting. Behind us would be a graph, so we could just look at each other and see how well we were doing.
it was easy to keep work open between people. So if I saw P-Chat leveling off for the week, it's just like, hey, you have 40 hours worth of work you still need to complete. And we haven't made any dent in that over the past 4 days. So it was nice because we did have the graph there, but I don't know. I think Drive is really the better tool for that. I can send the slides out too if you guys want. The YouTube video is really good. We showed it to the SE department, and I believe Martinez is trying to integrate it into his schedule as well. It's just really quick, and the guy at the end tries to pitch his product, which is like a Scrum tracker. Doesn't seem that great, and I think free tools are really the better option there. So, cool. Any further questions? Back.
Would you mind showing the YouTube video?
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's gonna be so meta. We're gonna have a video over video.
Hi, this is me. My name is Hamid Chojai,
Can you hear
and
it?
I've been
Okay.
involved with a number of software development projects over the years at a number of different companies, and I've come to recognize Scrum as one of the best agile development practices in use today. In this fast-paced video, I want to show you why Scrum is so great and how you can get started with Scrum in under 10 minutes. I'll cover all the core Scrum concepts, like product backlogs, team roles, sprints, burndown charts, and more. So get ready to be bombarded with information. Let's say this is the product we want to build. For this product, we get all kinds of feature requests from customers, executives, or even other team members. In Scrum, features are written from the perspective of the end user. Therefore, features are known as user stories. The collection of all these user stories is called the product backlog. Another way to think of the product backlog is to think of it as a wish list of all the things that would make this product great. Once we have our wish list, or the product backlog, we need to start planning which specific user stories we're going to be putting into a particular release of our product. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's back up a bit. To build this product, we need to have one or more people in our team who are going to play a variety of roles. First, we need her. She plays the role of product owner and helps make sure the right features make it into the product backlog, representing the users and customers of the product. She helps set the direction of the product. Then we need this guy. He's the Scrum Master, and his job is to make sure the project is progressing smoothly and that every member of the team has the tools they need to get their job done. He sets up meetings, monitors the work being done, and facilitates release planning. He's a lot like a project manager, but that's such a boring title, so we'll call him a Scrum Master to imply he knows some jujitsu. And the rest of the team has similar roles to other development processes. These guys build the product, while these guys test it to make sure it works right. These guys use it and hopefully pay for it. And these guys, they generally get in the way. And it turns out you can't build many products without them. But let's get back to this, release planning. To plan a release, the team starts with this, the product backlog, and they identify the user stories they want to put into this release. These user stories then become part of the release backlog. The team then prioritizes the user stories and estimates the amount of work involved for each item. Sometimes larger user stories are broken down into smaller, more manageable chunks. The collection of all the estimates provides a rough idea of the total amount of work involved to complete the entire release. A quick side note about estimates. There are a lot of techniques for creating good estimates. Some prefer estimating in story points, where estimates are made relative to building a small component with a known level of difficulty. Unfortunately, story points don't answer the question of, when will my project ship? I've found that the best technique is to estimate work in hours, but to use some standards in how estimates are done. For example, things that take less than a day to complete will be estimated as 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours. Every item will fall into one of those buckets. There will be no 3-hour estimates, for example. A 3-hour item would fall into the 4-hour bucket. Larger items will be estimated as 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, or 10 days. Again, all estimates in between will fall into the next larger bucket. Extremely large items are similarly estimated in months, 1, 2, 3, or 6 months. But the reality is that such items will need to be broken down substantially before work actually begins. We'll come back to these estimates in just a minute. But for now, let's get back to this, the release backlog. With a prioritized set of user stories and the estimated amount of work at hand, we're now ready to plan out several sprints to get the work done. Sprints are short-duration milestones that allow teams to tackle a manageable chunk of the project and get it to a ship-ready state. Sprints generally range from a couple of days to as much as 30 days in length, depending on the product's release cycles. The shorter the release cycles, the shorter each sprint should be. And you want to have at least 2 to as many as a dozen sprints in a given release. So at this point, we can take our release backlog and split it up into several of these, sprint backlogs. One of the most important things to remember about sprints is that the goal of each sprint is to get a subset of the release backlog to a ship-ready state. So at the end of each sprint, you should have a fully tested product with all the features of the sprint 100% complete. Since sprints are a very short but a realistic representation of part of the product, a late finish of the sprint is a great indicator that the project is not on schedule and something needs to be done. Therefore, it's extremely important to monitor the progress of each sprint with this, a burn-down chart. The burn-down chart is the #1 reason for Scrum's popularity and one of the best project visibility tools to ensure a project is progressing smoothly. The burn-down chart provides a day-by-day measure of the amount of work that remains in a given sprint or release. In this graph, you can see that the amount of work remaining bounces up and down from day to day, but is generally trending towards 0. Because historical information is provided in the burn-down chart, it's easy to see if the team is on the right track. Using the burn-down chart, the team can quickly calculate this, the slope of the graph, which is also called the burn-down velocity. This is the average rate of productivity for each day. For example, a team's rate of productivity might be that on a typical day they finish approximately 50 hours of work. Knowing that, it's possible to calculate an estimated completion date for the sprint, or even for the entire release based on the amount of work remaining. What's great about the burn-down chart is that we can compare our actual velocity and projected completion date to what the team needs to do in order to finish on time. This is perhaps the most useful piece of knowledge that any team member, product owner, or product executive can have about the project, because knowing whether or not the project is on track early in the schedule can help teams make the proper adjustments necessary to get the project on track. The burn-down chart provides empirical proof that the project is on track or if it's going to be late. So let's talk a little about where the data for this incredibly useful burn-down chart comes from. As you recall, part of the release planning process was to create an estimate for each user story in the release backlog. The collection of these estimates for a given sprint represents the total amount of work that must be done to complete that sprint. As each team member goes through and makes progress on one or more of the user stories, they simply update the amount of time remaining for each of their own items. So the total amount of time remaining on the group of user stories that make up a sprint changes on a day-by-day basis, hopefully going downward until it hits 0 when the sprint is complete. The burndown chart aggregates the remaining work data and shows it visually. It's brilliant because it communicates a massive amount of information in just a few seconds. And that brings us to this, the daily scrum. The daily scrum is an essential tool to having communication flow freely between team members. The idea is to have fast-paced, stand-up meetings where team members quickly list the work they have completed since the last meeting and any obstacles in their way. By meeting daily, it ensures the team is always in sync and any major issues are dealt with as soon as they are known. Finally, as each sprint comes to a finish, it's important to have a sprint retrospective meeting where the team can reflect on what went right and areas of improvement. After all, Scrum is a flexible, agile development method that needs constant improving and tweaking for every team. So there you have it, Scrum in under 10 minutes. You now know all the essential concepts to start implementing Scrum inside of your organization. But wait a second.
So from here on out, he tries to sell you his product. It's not fun, but I don't know. I think the video covers a lot of really good information. I think it misleads you a little bit. I don't like bar graphs for time, just because even though it's supposed to reflect how many hours are remaining, I think a line graph visually represents that a little bit more. If you really want, you can use like a shaded line graph underneath. And I don't know. Any other questions? Awesome. Thanks, guys.